Chapters 50 and 51 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 50. As the Countess Jemimy was not acquainted with the ancient monuments, Isabel occasionally offered to introduce her to these interesting relics, and to give their afternoon drive an antiquarian aim. The Countess, who professed to think her sister-in-law a prodigy of learning, never made an objection, and gazed at masses of Roman brickwork as patiently as if they had been mounds of modern drapery. She had not the historic sense, though she had in some directions the anecdotic, and as regards herself the apologetic. But she was so delighted to be in Rome that she only desired to float with the current. She would gladly have passed an hour every day in the damp darkness of the baths of Titus, if it had been a condition of her remaining at Palazzo Roccanera. Isabel, however, was not a severe cicerone. She used to visit the ruins chiefly because they offered an excuse for talking about other matters than the love affairs of the ladies of Florence, as to which her companion was never weary of offering information. It must be added that during these visits the Countess forbade herself every form of active research. Her preference was to sit in the carriage and exclaim that everything was most interesting. It was in this manner that she had hitherto examined the Colosseum, to the infinite regret of her niece, who, with all the respect that she owed her, could not see why she should not descend from the vehicle and enter the building. Pansy had so little chance to ramble that her view of the case was not wholly disinterested. It may be divined that she had a secret hope that, once inside, her parents' guest might be induced to climb to the upper tiers. There came a day when the Countess announced her willingness to undertake this feat, a mild afternoon in March, when the windy month expressed itself in occasional puffs of spring. The three ladies went into the Colosseum together, but Isabel left her companions to wander over the place. She had often ascended to those desolate ledges from which the Roman crowd used to bellow applause, and where now the wild flowers, when they are allowed, bloom in the deep crevices, and to-day she felt weary and disposed to sit in the despoiled arena. It made an intermission, too, for the Countess often asked more from one's attention than she gave in return, and Isabel believed that when she was alone with her niece, she let the dust gather for a moment on the ancient scandals of the Arnide. She so remained below, therefore, while Pansy guided her undiscriminating aunt to the steep brick staircase at the foot of which the custodian unlocks the tall wooden gate. The great enclosure was half in shadow. The western sun brought out the pale red tone of the great blocks of travertine, the latent colour that is the only living element in the immense ruin. Here and there wandered a peasant or a tourist, looking up at the far skyline, where, in the clear stillness, a multitude of swallows kept circling and plunging. Isabel presently became aware that one of the other visitors, planted in the middle of the arena, had turned his attention to her own person, and was looking at her with a certain little poise of the head which she had some weeks before perceived to be characteristic of baffled but indestructible purpose. Such an attitude, to-day, could belong only to Mr. Edward Rozier, and this gentleman proved in fact to have been considering the question of speaking to her. But he had assured himself that she was unaccompanied. He drew near, remarking that though she would not answer his letters, she would perhaps not wholly close her ears to his spoken eloquence. She replied that her stepdaughter was close at hand, and that she could only give him 5 minutes, whereupon he took out his watch and sat down upon a broken block. "It's very soon told," said Edward Rozier. "I've sold all my bibelots." Isabel gave instinctively an exclamation of horror. It was as if he had told her that he had had all his teeth drawn. "I've sold them by auction at the Hôtel Drouot," he went on. "The sale took place 3 days ago, and they've telegraphed me the result. It's magnificent." "I'm glad to hear it, but I wish you had kept your pretty things." "I have the money instead, $50,000. Will Mr. Osmond think me rich enough now?" "Is it for that you did it?" Isabel asked gently. "For what else in the world could it be? That's the only thing I think of. I went to Paris and made my arrangements. I couldn't stop for the sale. I couldn't have seen them going off. I think it would have killed me. But I put them into good hands, and they brought high prices. I should tell you I have kept my enamels. Now I have the money in my pocket, and he can't say I'm poor," the young man exclaimed defiantly. "He'll say now that you're not wise," said Isabel, as if Gilbert Osmond had never said this before. Rozier gave her a sharp look. "Do you mean that without my bibelots I'm nothing? Do you mean they were the best thing about me? That's what they told me in Paris. Oh, they were very frank about it, but they hadn't seen her." "My dear friend, you deserve to succeed," said Isabel very kindly. "You say that so sadly that it's the same as if you said I shouldn't." And he questioned her eyes with the clear trepidation of his own. He had the air of a man who knows he has been the talk of Paris for a week, and is full half a head taller in consequence, but who also has a painful suspicion that in spite of this increase of stature one or two persons still have the perversity to think him diminutive. "I know what happened here while I was away," he went on. "What does Mr. Osmond expect after she has refused Lord Warburton?" Isabel debated. "That she'll marry another nobleman." "What other nobleman?" "One that he'll pick out." Rozier slowly got up, putting his watch into his waistcoat pocket. "You're laughing at some one, but this time I don't think it's at me." "I didn't mean to laugh," said Isabel. "I laugh very seldom. Now you had better go away." "I feel very safe," Rozier declared without moving. This might be, but it evidently made him feel more so to make the announcement in rather a loud voice, balancing himself a little complacently on his toes and looking all round the Colosseum as if it were filled with an audience. Suddenly Isabel saw him change colour. There was more of an audience than he had suspected. She turned and perceived that her two companions had returned from their excursion. "You must really go away," she said quickly. "Ah, my dear lady, pity me," Edward Rozier murmured in a voice strangely at variance with the announcement I have just quoted. And then he added eagerly, like a man who in the midst of his misery is seized by a happy thought, "Is that lady the Countess Jemimy? I've a great desire to be presented to her." Isabel looked at him a moment. "She has no influence with her brother." "Ah, what a monster you make him out!" And Rozier faced the Countess, who advanced in front of Pansy, with an animation partly due perhaps to the fact that she perceived her sister-in-law to be engaged in conversation with a very pretty young man. "I'm glad you kept your enamels," Isabel called as she left him. She went straight to Pansy, who, on seeing Edward Rozier, had stopped short with lowered eyes. "We'll go back to the carriage," she said gently. "Yes, it's getting late," Pansy returned more gently still, and she went on without a murmur, without faltering or glancing back. Isabel, however, allowing herself this last liberty, saw that a meeting had immediately taken place between the Countess and Mr. Rozier. He had removed his hat and was bowing and smiling. He had evidently introduced himself, while the Countess's expressive back displayed to Isabel's eye a gracious inclination. These facts, none the less, were presently lost to sight, for Isabel and Pansy took their places again in the carriage. Pansy, who faced her stepmother, at first kept her eyes fixed on her lap. Then she raised them and rested them on Isabel's. There shone out of each of them a little melancholy ray, a spark of timid passion which touched Isabel to the heart. At the same time a wave of envy passed over her soul, as she compared the tremulous longing, the definite ideal of the child, with her own dry despair. "Poor little Pansy," she affectionately said. "Oh, never mind," Pansy answered in the tone of eager apology. And then there was a silence. The Countess was a long time coming. "Did you show your aunt everything, and did she enjoy it?" Isabel asked at last. "Yes, I showed her everything. I think she was very much pleased." "And you're not tired, I hope?" "Oh, no, thank you, I'm not tired." The Countess still remained behind, so that Isabel requested the footman to go into the Colosseum and tell her they were waiting. He presently returned with the announcement that the Signora Contessa begged them not to wait, she would come home in a cab. About a week after this lady's quick sympathies had enlisted themselves with Mr. Rozier, Isabel, going rather late to dress for dinner, found Pansy sitting in her room. The girl seemed to have been awaiting her. She got up from her low chair. "Pardon my taking the liberty," she said in a small voice. "It will be the last for some time." Her voice was strange, and her eyes, widely opened, had an excited, frightened look. "You're not going away?" Isabel exclaimed. "I'm going to the convent." "To the convent?" Pansy drew nearer, till she was near enough to put her arms round Isabel and rest her head on her shoulder. She stood this way a moment, perfectly still, but her companion could feel her tremble. The quiver of her little body expressed everything she was unable to say. Isabel nevertheless pressed her. "Why are you going to the convent?" "Because papa thinks it's best. He says a young girl's better, every now and then, for making a little retreat. He says the world, always the world, is very bad for a young girl. This is just a chance for a little seclusion, a little reflection." Pansy spoke in short, detached sentences, as if she could scarce trust herself, and then she added with a triumph of self-control, "I think papa's right. I've been so much in the world this winter." Her announcement had a strange effect on Isabel. It seemed to carry a larger meaning than the girl herself knew. "When was this decided?" she asked. "I've heard nothing of it." "Papa told me half an hour ago. He thought it better it shouldn't be too much talked about in advance. Madame Catherine's to come for me at 7:15, and I'm only to take 2 frocks. It's only for a few weeks. I'm sure it will be very good. I shall find all those ladies who used to be so kind to me, and I shall see the little girls who are being educated. I'm very fond of little girls," said Pansy, with an effect of diminutive grandeur. "And I'm also very fond of Mother Catherine. I shall be very quiet and think a great deal." Isabel listened to her, holding her breath. She was almost awestruck. "Think of me sometimes." "Ah, come and see me soon!" cried Pansy, and the cry was very different from the heroic remarks of which she had just delivered herself. Isabel could say nothing more. She understood nothing. She only felt how little she yet knew her husband. Her answer to his daughter was a long, tender kiss. Half an hour later she learned from her maid that Madame Catherine had arrived in a cab, and had departed again with the Signorina. On going to the drawing-room before dinner she found the Countess Gemini alone, and this lady characterized the incident by exclaiming, with a wonderful toss of the head, "En voilà, ma chère, une pause!" But if it was an affectation, she was at a loss to see what her husband affected. She could only dimly perceive that he had more traditions than she supposed. It had become her habit to be so careful as to what she said to him that, strange as it may appear, she hesitated for several minutes after he had come in to allude to his daughter's sudden departure. She spoke of it only after they were seated at table. But she had forbidden herself ever to ask Osmond a question. All she could do was to make a declaration, and there was one that came very naturally. I shall miss Pansy very much." He looked a while, with his head inclined a little, at the basket of flowers in the middle of the table. "Ah, yes," he said at last. "I had thought of that. You must go and see her, you know, but not too often. I dare say you wonder why I sent her to the good sisters, but I doubt if I can make you understand. It doesn't matter. Don't trouble yourself about it. That's why I had not spoken of it. I didn't believe you would enter into it. But I've always had the idea. I've always thought it part of an education of one's daughter. One's daughter should be fresh and fair. She should be innocent and gentle. With the manners of the present time, she is liable to become so dusty and crumpled. Pansy's a little dusty, a little dishevelled. She has knocked about too much. This bustling, pushing rabble that calls itself society, one should take her out of it occasionally. Convents are very quiet, very convenient, very salutary. I like to think of her there, in the old garden, under the arcade, among those tranquil, virtuous women. Many of them are gentlewomen born, some of them are noble. She will have her books and her drawing. She will have her piano. I've made the most liberal arrangements. There is to be nothing ascetic. There's just to be a certain little sense of sequestration. She'll have time to think, and there's something I want her to think about." Osmond spoke deliberately, reasonably, still with his head on one side, as if he were looking at the basket of flowers. His tone, however, was that of a man not so much offering an explanation as putting a thing into words, almost into pictures, to see himself how it would look. He considered a while the picture he had evoked, and seemed greatly pleased with it. And then he went on. "The Catholics are very wise, after all. The convent is a great institution. We can't do without it. It corresponds to an essential need in families, in society. It's a school of good manners. It's a school of repose. Oh, I don't want to detach my daughter from the world," he added. "I don't want to make her fix her thoughts on any other. This one's very well, as she should take it, and she may think of it as much as she likes. Only she must think of it in the right way." Isabel gave an extreme attention to this little sketch. She found it indeed intensely interesting. It seemed to show her how far her husband's desire to be effective was capable of going, to the point of playing theoretic tricks on the delicate organism of his daughter. She could not understand his purpose, no, not wholly, but she understood it better than he supposed or desired, inasmuch as she was convinced that the whole proceeding was an elaborate mystification addressed to herself and destined to act upon her imagination. He had wanted to do something sudden and arbitrary, something unexpected and refined, to mark the difference between his sympathies and her own, and show that if he regarded his daughter as a precious work of art, it was natural he should be more and more careful about the finishing touches. If he wished to be effective, he had succeeded. The incident struck a chill into Isabel's heart. Pansy had known the convent in her childhood, and had found a happy home there. She was fond of the good sisters, who were very fond of her, and there was therefore for the moment no definite hardship in her lot. But all the same, the girl had taken fright. The impression her father desired to make would evidently be sharp enough. The old Protestant tradition had never faded from Isabel's imagination, and as her thoughts attached themselves to this striking example of her husband's genius, she sat looking, like him, at the basket of flowers. Poor little Pansy became the heroine of a tragedy. Osmond wished it to be known that he shrank from nothing, and his wife found it hard to pretend to eat her dinner. There was a certain relief presently in hearing the high, strained voice of her sister-in-law. The Countess, too, apparently had been thinking the thing out, but had arrived at a different conclusion from Isabel. "It's very absurd, my dear Osmond," she said, "to invent so many pretty reasons for poor Pansy's banishment. Why don't you say at once that you want to get her out of my way? Haven't you discovered that I think very well of Mr. Rozier? I do indeed. He seems to me simpaticissimo. He has made me believe in true love. I never did before. Of course you've made up your mind that with those convictions I'm dreadful company for Pansy." Osmond took a sip of a glass of wine. He looked perfectly good-humoured. "My dear Amy," he answered, smiling as if he were uttering a piece of gallantry, "I don't know anything about your convictions, but if I suspected that they interfere with mine, it would be much simpler to banish you." Chapter 50. Chapter 51. The Countess was not banished, but she felt the insecurity of her tenure of her brother's hospitality. A week after this incident, Isabel received a telegram from England, dated from Gardencourt, and bearing the stamp of Mrs. Touchett's authorship. "Ralph cannot last many days," it ran, "and if convenient would like to see you. Wishes me to say that you must come only if you've no other duties. Say for myself that you used to talk a good deal about your duty and to wonder what it was. Shall be curious to see whether you've found it out. Ralph is really dying, and there's no other company." Isabel was prepared for this news, having received from Henrietta Stackpole a detailed account of her journey to England with her appreciative patient. Ralph had arrived more dead than alive, but she had managed to convey him to Gardencourt, where he had taken to his bed, which, as Miss Stackpole wrote, he evidently would never leave again. She added that she had really had two patients on her hands instead of one, inasmuch as Mr. Goodwood, who had been of no earthly use, was quite as ailing, in a different way, as Mr. Touchett. Afterwards she wrote that she had been obliged to surrender the field to Mrs. Touchett, who had just returned from America, and had promptly given her to understand that she didn't wish any interviewing at Gardencourt. Isabel had written to her aunt shortly after Ralph came to Rome, letting her know of his critical condition, and suggesting that she should lose no time in returning to Europe. Mrs. Touchett had telegraphed an acknowledgment of this admonition, and the only further news Isabel received from her was the second telegram I have just quoted. Isabel stood a moment looking at the latter missive, then thrusting it into her pocket, she went straight to the door of her husband's study. Here she again paused an instant, after which she opened the door and went in. Osmond was seated at the table near the window, with a folio volume before him, propped against a pile of books. This volume was open at a page of small coloured plates, and Isabel presently saw that he had been copying from it the drawing of an antique coin. A box of water-colours and fine brushes lay before him, and he had already transferred to the sheet of immaculate paper the delicate, finely tinted disc. His back was turned toward the door, but he recognized his wife without looking around. "Excuse me for disturbing you," she said. "When I come to your room I always knock," he answered, going on with his work. "I forgot. I had something else to think of. My cousin's dying." "Ah, I don't believe that," said Osmond, looking at his drawing through a magnifying glass. "He was dying when we married. He'll outlive us all." Isabel gave herself no time, no thought, to appreciate the careful cynicism of this declaration. She simply went on quickly, full of her own intention. "My aunt has telegraphed for me. I must go to Gardencourt." "Why must you go to Gardencourt?" Osmond asked in the tone of impartial curiosity. "To see Ralph before he dies." To this for some time he made no rejoinder. He continued to give his chief attention to his work, which was of a sort that would brook no negligence. "I don't see the need of it," he said at last. "He came to see you here. I didn't like that. I thought his being in Rome a great mistake. But I tolerated it, because it was to be the last time you should see him. Now you tell me it's not to have been the last. Ah, you're not grateful." "What am I to be grateful for?" Gilbert Osmond laid down his little implements, blew a speck of dust from his drawing, slowly got up, and for the first time looked at his wife. "For my not having interfered while he was here. I remember perfectly how distinctly you let me know you didn't like it. I was very glad when he went away." "Leave him alone, then. Don't run after him." Isabel turned her eyes away from him. They rested upon his little drawing. "I must go to England," she said, with the full consciousness that her tone might strike an irritable man of taste as stupidly obstinate. "I shall not like it if you do," Osmond remarked. "Why should I mind that? You won't like me if I don't. You like nothing I do or don't do. You pretend to think I lie." Osmond turned slightly pale. He gave a cold smile. "That's why you must go, then? Not to see your cousin, but to take a revenge on me." "I know nothing about revenge." "I do," said Osmond. "Don't give me an occasion." "You're only too eager to take one. You wish immensely that I would commit some folly." "I should be gratified in that case if you disobeyed me." "If I disobeyed you?" said Isabel, in a low tone which had the effect of mildness. "Let it be clear. If you leave Rome to-day, it will be a piece of the most deliberate, the most calculated opposition." "How can you call it calculated? I received my aunt's telegram but 3 minutes ago." "You calculate rapidly. It's a great accomplishment. I don't see why we should prolong our discussion. You know my wish." And he stood there as if he expected to see her withdraw. But she never moved. She couldn't move, strange as it may seem. She still wished to justify herself. He had the power, in an extraordinary degree, of making her feel this need. There was something in her imagination he could always appeal to against her judgment. "You've no reason for such a wish," said Isabel, "and I've every reason for going. I can't tell you how unjust you seem to me. But I think you know. It's your own opposition that's calculated. It's malignant." She had never uttered her worst thought to her husband before, and the sensation of hearing it was evidently new to Osmond. But he showed no surprise, and his coolness was apparently a proof that he had believed his wife would in fact be unable to resist for ever his ingenious endeavour to draw her out. "It's all the more intense, then," he answered, and he added, almost as if he were giving her a friendly counsel, "This is a very important matter." She recognized that. She was fully conscious of the weight of the occasion. She knew that between them they had arrived at a crisis. Its gravity made her careful. She said nothing, and he went on. "You say I've no reason. I have the very best. I dislike from the bottom of my soul what you intend to do. It's dishonourable, it's indelicate, it's indecent. Your cousin is nothing whatever to me, and I'm under no obligation to make concessions to him. I've already made the very handsomest. Your relations with him while he was here kept me on pins and needles, but I let that pass because from week to week I expected him to go. I've never liked him, and he has never liked me. That's why you like him, because he hates me," said Osmond, with a quick, barely audible tremor in his voice. "I've an ideal of what my wife should do and should not do. She should not travel across Europe alone, in defiance of my deepest desire, to sit at the bedside of other men. Your cousin's nothing to you, he's nothing to us. You smile most expressively when I talk about us, but I assure you that we, Mrs. Osmond, is all I know. I take our marriage seriously. You appear to have found a way of not doing so. I'm not aware that we're divorced or separated. For me, we're indissolubly united. You are nearer to me than any human creature, and I'm nearer to you. It may be a disagreeable proximity. It's one, at any rate, of our own deliberate making. You don't like to be reminded of that, I know, but I'm perfectly willing, because... And he paused a moment, looking as if he had something to say which would be very much to the point. "Because I think we should accept the consequences of our actions and what I value most in life is the honor of a thing." He spoke gravely and almost gently. The accent of sarcasm had dropped out of his tone. It had a gravity which checked his wife's quick emotion. The resolution with which she had entered the room found itself caught in a mesh of fine threads. His last words were not command. They constituted a kind of appeal. And though she felt that any expression of respect on his part could only be a refinement of egotism, they represented something transcendent and absolute, like the sign of the cross or the flag of one's country. He spoke in the name of something sacred and precious, the observance of a magnificent form. They were as perfectly apart in feeling as two disillusioned lovers had ever been, but they had never yet separated in act. Isabel had not changed. Her old passion for justice still abode within her, and now, in the very thick of her sense of her husband's blasphemous sophistry, it began to throb to a tune which for a moment promised him the victory. It came over her that in his wish to preserve appearances he was, after all, sincere, and that this, as far as it went, was a merit. 10 minutes before she had felt all the joy of irreflective action, a joy to which she had so long been a stranger. But action had been suddenly changed to slow renunciation, transformed by the blight of Osmond's touch. If she must renounce, however, she would let him know she was a victim rather than a dupe. "I know you're a master of the art of mockery," she said. "How can you speak of an indissoluble union? How can you speak of your being contented? Where's our union when you accuse me of falsity? Where's your contentment when you have nothing but hideous suspicion in your heart? It is in our living decently together in spite of such drawbacks." "We don't live decently together," cried Isabel. "Indeed we don't, if you go to England." "That's very little. That's nothing. I might do much more." He raised his eyebrows and even his shoulders a little. He had lived long enough in Italy to catch this trick. "Ah, if you've come to threaten me, I prefer my drawing." And he walked back to his table, where he took up the sheet of paper on which he had been working, and stood studying it. "I suppose that if I go you'll not expect me to come back," said Isabel. He turned quickly round, and she could see this movement at least was not designed. He looked at her a little, and then, "Are you out of your mind?" he inquired. "How can it be anything but a rupture?" she went on, "especially if all you say is true." She was unable to see how it could be anything but a rupture. She sincerely wished to know what else it might be. He sat down before his table. "I really can't argue with you on the hypothesis of your defying me," he said, and he took up one of his little brushes again. She lingered but a moment longer, long enough to embrace with her eye his whole deliberately indifferent yet most expressive figure, after which she quickly left the room. Her faculties, her energy, her passion, were all dispersed again. She felt as if a cold, dark mist had suddenly encompassed her. Osmond possessed in a supreme degree the art of eliciting any weakness. On her way back to her room she found the Countess Gemini standing in the open doorway of a little parlour in which a small collection of heterogeneous books had been arranged. The Countess had an open volume in her hand. She appeared to have been glancing down a page which failed to strike her as interesting. At the sound of Isabel's step she raised her head. "Ah, my dear," she said, "you, who are so literary, do tell me some amusing book to read. Everything here's of a dreariness. Do you think this would do me any good?" Isabel glanced at the title of the volume she held out, but without reading or understanding it. "I'm afraid I can't advise you. I've had bad news. My cousin, Ralph Touchett, is dying." The Countess threw down her book. "Ah, he was so simpatico. I'm awfully sorry for you." "You would be sorrier still if you knew." "What is there to know? You look very badly," the Countess added. "You must have been with Osmond." Half an hour before Isabel would have listened very coldly to an intimation that she should ever feel a desire for the sympathy of her sister-in-law, and there can be no better proof of her present embarrassment than the fact she almost clutched at this lady's fluttering attention. "I've been with Osmond," she said, while the Countess's bright eye glittered at her. "I'm sure, then, he has been odious!" the Countess cried. "Did he say he was glad poor Mr. Touchett's dying?" "He said it's impossible I should go to England." The Countess's mind, when her interests were concerned, was agile. She already foresaw the extinction of any further brightness in her visit to Rome. Ralph Touchett would die, Isabel would go into mourning, and then there would be no more dinner parties. Such a prospect produced for a moment in her countenance an expressive grimace, but this rapid, picturesque play of feature was her only tribute to disappointment. After all, she reflected, the game was almost played out. She had already overstayed her invitation. And then she cared enough for Isabel's trouble to forget her own, and she saw that Isabel's trouble was deep. It seemed deeper than the mere death of a cousin, and the Countess had no hesitation in connecting her exasperating brother with the expression of her sister-in-law's eyes. Her heart beat with an almost joyous expectation, for if she had wished to see Osmond overtopped, the conditions looked favourable now. Of course, if Isabel should go to England, she herself would immediately leave Palazzo Roccanera. Nothing would induce her to remain there with Osmond. Nevertheless, she felt an immense desire to hear that Isabel would go to England. "Nothing's impossible for you, my dear," she said caressingly. "Why else are you rich and clever and good?" "Why, indeed? I feel stupidly weak." "Why does Osmond say it's impossible?" the Countess asked in a tone which sufficiently declared that she couldn't imagine. From the moment she thus began to question her, however, Isabel drew back. She disengaged her hand, which the Countess had affectionately taken. But she answered this inquiry with frank bitterness. "Because we're so happy together that we can't separate even for a fortnight." "Ah!" cried the Countess, while Isabel turned away. "When I want to make a journey, my husband simply tells me I can have no money." Isabel went to her room, where she walked up and down for an hour. It may appear to some readers that she gave herself much trouble, and it is certain that for a woman of a high spirit she had allowed herself easily to be arrested. It seemed to her that only now she fully measured the great undertaking of matrimony. Marriage meant that in such a case as this, when one had to choose, one chose as a matter of course for one's husband. "I'm afraid, yes, I'm afraid," she said to herself more than once, stopping short in her walk. But what she was afraid of was not her husband, his displeasure, his hatred, his revenge. It was not even her own later judgment of her conduct, a consideration which had often held her in check. It was simply the violence there would be going on when Osmond wished her to remain. A gulf of difference had opened between them, but nevertheless it was his desire that she should stay. It was a horror to him that she should go. She knew the nervous fineness with which he could feel an objection. What he thought of her she knew. What he was capable of saying to her she had felt. Yet they were married for all that, and marriage meant that a woman should cleave to the man with whom, uttering tremendous vows, she had stood at the altar. She sank down on her sofa at last and buried her head in a pile of cushions. When she raised her head again, the Countess Jemimy hovered before her. She had come in all unperceived. She had a strange smile on her thin lips, and her whole face had grown in an hour a shining intimation. She lived assuredly, it might be said, at the window of her spirit, but now she was leaning far out. "I knocked," she began, "but you didn't answer me. So I ventured in. I've been looking at you for the last 5 minutes. You're very unhappy." "Yes, but I don't think you can comfort me." "Will you give me leave to try?" And the Countess sat down on the sofa beside her. She continued to smile, and there was something communicative and exultant in her expression. She appeared to have a deal to say, and it occurred to Isabel for the first time that her sister-in-law might say something really human. She made play with her glittering eyes, in which there was an unpleasant fascination. "After all," she soon resumed, "I must tell you, to begin with, that I don't understand your state of mind. You seem to have so many scruples, so many reasons, so many ties. When I discovered, 10 years ago, that my husband's dearest wish was to make me miserable, of late he has simply let me alone. It was a wonderful simplification. My poor Isabel, you're not simple enough." "No, I'm not simple enough," said Isabel. "There's something I want you to know," the Countess declared, "because I think you ought to know it. Perhaps you do, perhaps you've guessed it. But if you have, all I can say is that I understand still less why you shouldn't do as you like." "What do you wish me to know?" Isabel felt a foreboding that made her heart beat faster. The Countess was about to justify herself, and this alone was portentous. But she was nevertheless disposed to play a little with her subject. "In your place I should have guessed it ages ago. Have you never really suspected?" "I've guessed nothing. What should I have suspected? I don't know what you mean." "That's because you've such a beastly pure mind. I never saw a woman with such a pure mind," cried the Countess. Isabel slowly got up. "You're going to tell me something horrible." "You can call it by whatever name you will." And the Countess rose also, while her gathered perversity grew vivid and dreadful. She stood a moment in a sort of glare of intention, and, as seemed to Isabel even then, of ugliness. After which she said, "My first sister-in-law had no children." Isabel stared back at her. The announcement was an anticlimax. "Your first sister-in-law?" "I suppose you know, at least, if one may mention it, that Osmond has been married before. I've never spoken to you of his wife. I thought it mightn't be decent or respectful. But others, less particular, must have done so. The poor little woman lived hardly 3 years and died childless. It wasn't till after her death that Pansy arrived." Isabel's brow had contracted to a frown. Her lips were parted in pale, vague wonder. She was trying to follow. There seemed so much more to follow than she could see. "Pansy's not my husband's child, then?" "Your husband's, in perfection. But no one else's husband's. Some one else's wife's." "Ah, my good Isabel!" cried the Countess. "With you one must dot one's I's." "I don't understand. Whose wife's?" Isabel asked. "The wife of a horrid little Swiss who died, how long? A dozen, more than 15 years ago. He never recognized Miss Pansy, nor, knowing what he was about, would have anything to say to her. And there was no reason why he should. Osmond did, and that was better, though he had to fit on afterwards the whole rigmarole of his own wife's having died in childbirth, and of his having, in grief and horror, banished the little girl from his sight for as long as possible before taking her home from nurse. His wife had really died, you know, of quite another matter, and in quite another place, in the Piedmontese mountains, where they had gone one August, because her health appeared to require the air, but where she was suddenly taken worse, fatally ill. The story passed sufficiently. It was covered by the appearances so long as nobody heeded, as nobody cared to look into it. But of course I knew, without researches, the Countess lucidly proceeded. As also you'll understand without a word said between us. I mean between Osmond and me. Don't you see him looking at me in silence that way to settle it? That is, to settle me if I should say anything? I said nothing, right or left, never a word to a creature, if you can believe that of me. On my honour, my dear, I speak of the thing to you now, after all this time, as I've never, never spoken. It was to be enough for me from the first that the child was my niece, from the moment she was my brother's daughter. As for her veritable mother—" But with this Pansy's wonderful aunt dropped, as, involuntarily, from the impression of her sister-in-law's face, out of which more eyes might have been seen to look at her than she had ever had to meet. She had spoken no name, yet Isabel could but check on her own lips an echo of the unspoken. She sank to her seat again, hanging her head. "Why have you told me this?" she asked in a voice the Countess hardly recognized. "Because I've been so bored with your not knowing. I've been bored, frankly, my dear, with not having told you, as if, stupidly all this time, I couldn't have managed. Ça me dépasse, if you don't mind my saying so, the things all around you that you've appeared to succeed in not knowing. It's a sort of assistance, aid to innocent ignorance, that I've always been a bad hand at rendering, and in this connection, that of keeping quiet for my brother, my virtue has at any rate finally found itself exhausted. It's not a black lie, moreover, you know," the Countess inimitably added. "The facts are exactly what I tell you." "I had no idea," said Isabel presently, and looked up at her in a manner that doubtless matched the apparent witlessness of this confession. "So I believed, though it was hard to believe. Had it never occurred to you that he was for 6 or 7 years her lover?" "I don't know. Things have occurred to me, and perhaps that was what they all meant." "She has been wonderfully clever. She has been magnificent about Pansy," the Countess, before all this view of it, cried. "Oh, no idea from me," Isabel went on, "ever definitely took that form." She appeared to be making out to herself what had been and what hadn't. "And as it is, I don't understand." She spoke as one troubled and puzzled, yet the poor Countess seemed to have seen her revelation fall below its possibilities of effect. She had expected to kindle some responsive blaze, but had barely extracted a spark. Isabel showed as scarce more impressed than she might have been as a young woman of approved imagination with some fine sinister passage of public history. "Don't you recognize how the child could never pass for her husband's? That is, with Monsieur Merle himself," her companion resumed. "They had been separated too long for that, and he had gone to some far country, I think to South America. If she had ever had children, which I'm not sure of, she had lost them. The conditions happened to make it workable, under stress, I mean at so awkward a pinch, that Osmond should acknowledge the little girl. His wife was dead, very true, but she had not been dead too long to put a certain accommodation of dates out of the question, from the moment, I mean, that suspicion wasn't started, which was what they had to take care of. What was more natural than that poor Mrs. Osmond, at a distance and for a world not troubling about trifles, should have left behind her, poverina, the pledge of her brief happiness that had cost her her life? With the aid of a change of residence, Osmond had been living with her at Naples at the time of their stay in the Alps, and he in due course left it for ever. The whole history was successfully set going. My poor sister-in-law in her grave couldn't help herself, and the real mother, to save her skin, renounced all visible property in the child. "Ah, poor, poor woman!" cried Isabel, who herewith burst into tears. It was a long time since she had shed any. She had suffered a high reaction from weeping, but now they flowed with an abundance in which the Countess Gemini found only another discomfiture. "It's very kind of you to pity her," she discordantly laughed. "Yes, indeed, you have a way of your own." "He must have been false to his wife, and so very soon," said Isabel with a sudden check. "That's all that's wanting, that you should take up her cause," the Countess went on. I quite agree with you, however, that it was much too soon." "But to me," and Isabel hesitated, as if she had not heard, as if her question, though it was sufficiently there in her eyes, were all for herself. "To you he has been faithful? Well, it depends, my dear, on what you call faithful. When he married you he was no longer the lover of another woman, such a lover as he had been, cara mia, between their risks and their precautions, while the thing lasted. That state of affairs had passed away. The lady had repented, or at all events, for reasons of her own, drawn back. She had always had, too, a worship of appearances so intense that even Osmond himself had got bored with it. You may therefore imagine what it was, when he couldn't patch it on conveniently to any of those he goes in for. But the whole past was between them." "Yes," Isabel mechanically echoed, "the whole past is between them." "Ah, this later past is nothing. But for 6 or 7 years, as I say, they had kept it up." She was silent a little. "Why, then, did she want him to marry me?" "Ah, my dear, that's her superiority. Because you had money, and because she believed you would be good to Pansy." "Poor woman! And Pansy, who doesn't like her!" cried Isabel. "That's the reason she wanted some one whom Pansy would like. She knows it. She knows everything." "Will she know that you told me this?" "That will depend upon whether you tell her. She's prepared for it. And do you know what she counts upon for her defence? On your believing that I lie. Perhaps you do. Don't make yourself uncomfortable to hide it. Only, as it happens this time, I don't. I've told plenty of little idiotic fibs, but they've never hurt any one but myself." Isabel sat staring at her companion's story, as at a bale of fantastic wares some strolling gypsy might have unpacked on the carpet at her feet. "Why did Osmond never marry her?" she finally asked. "Because she had no money." The Countess had an answer for everything, and if she lied well. "No one knows, no one has ever known, what she lives on, or how she has got all those beautiful things. I don't believe Osmond himself knows. Besides, she wouldn't have married him." "How could she have loved him, then?" "She doesn't love him in that way. She did at first, and then, I suppose, she would have married him, but at that time her husband was living. By the time Monsieur Merle had rejoined, I won't say his ancestors, because he never had any, her relations with Osmond had changed, and she had grown more ambitious. Besides, she has never had about him," the Countess went on, leaving Isabel to wince for it so tragically afterwards, "she had never had what you might call any illusions of intelligence. She hoped she might marry a great man. That has always been her idea. She has waited and watched and plotted and prayed, but she has never succeeded. I don't call Madame Merle a success, you know. I don't know what she may accomplish yet, but at present she has very little to show. The only tangible result she has ever achieved, except, of course, getting to know every one and staying with them free of expense, has been her bringing you and Osmond together. Oh, she did that, my dear. You needn't look as if you doubted it. I've watched them for years. I know everything, everything. I'm thought a great scatterbrain, but I've had enough application of mind to follow up those two. She hates me, and her way of showing it is to pretend to be forever defending me. When people say I've had 15 lovers, she looks horrified and declares that quite half of them were never proved. She has never been afraid of me for years, and she has taken great comfort in the vile, false things people have said about me. She has been afraid I'd expose her, and she threatened me one day when Osmond began to pay his court to you. It was at his house in Florence. Do you remember that afternoon when she brought you there and we had tea in the garden? She let me know then that if I should tell tales, 2 could play at that game. She pretends there's a good deal more to tell about me than about her. It would be an interesting comparison. I don't care a fig what she may say, simply because I know you don't care a fig. You can't trouble your head about me less than you do already. So she may take her revenge as she chooses. I don't think she'll frighten you very much. Her great idea has been to be tremendously irreproachable, a kind of full-blown lily, the incarnation of propriety. She has always worshipped that god. There should be no scandal about Caesar's wife, you know, and, as I say, she has always hoped to marry Caesar. That was one reason she wouldn't marry Osmond, the fear that on seeing her with Pansy people would put things together, would even see a resemblance. She has had a terror lest the mother should betray herself. She has been awfully careful. The mother has never done so." "Yes, yes, the mother has done so," said Isabel, who had listened to all this with a face more and more wan. "She betrayed herself to me the other day, though I didn't recognize her. There appeared to have been a chance of Pansy's making a great marriage, and in her disappointment at its not coming off, she almost dropped the mask." "Ah, that's where she'd dish herself," cried the Countess. "She has failed so dreadfully that she's determined her daughter shall make it up." Isabel started at the words, her daughter, which her guest threw off so familiarly. "It seems very wonderful," she murmured, and in this bewildering impression she had almost lost her sense of being personally touched by the story. "Now, don't go and turn against the poor innocent child," the Countess went on. "She's very nice, in spite of her deplorable origin. I myself have liked Pansy, not naturally because she was hers, but because she had become yours." "Yes, she has become mine. And how the poor woman must have suffered at seeing me!" Isabel exclaimed, while she flushed at the thought. "I don't believe she has suffered. On the contrary, she has enjoyed. Osmond's marriage has given his daughter a great little lift. Before that she lived in a hole. And do you know what the mother thought? That you might take such a fancy to the child that you'd do something for her. Osmond, of course, could never give her a portion. Osmond was really extremely poor, but of course you know all about that." "Ah, my dear," cried the Countess, "why did you ever inherit money?" She stopped a moment, as if she saw something singular in Isabel's face. "Don't tell me now that you'll give her a dot. You're capable of that, but I would refuse to believe it. Don't try to be too good. Be a little easy and natural and nasty. Feel a little wicked for the comfort of it once in your life." "It's very strange. I suppose I ought to know, but I'm sorry," Isabel said. "I'm much obliged to you." "Yes, you seem to be," cried the Countess with a mocking laugh. "Perhaps you are, perhaps you're not. You don't take it as I should have thought." "How should I take it?" Isabel asked. "Well, I should say as a woman who has been made use of." Isabel made no answer to this. She only listened, and the Countess went on. "They've always been bound to each other. They remained so even after she broke off, or he did. But he has always been more for her than she has been for him. When their little carnival was over, they made a bargain that each should give the other complete liberty, but that each should also do everything possible to help the other on. You may ask how I know such a thing as that. I know it by the way they've behaved. Now see how much better women are than men. She has found a wife for Osmond, but Osmond has never lifted a finger for her. She has worked for him, plotted for him, suffered for him. She has even more than once found money for him. And the end of it is that he's tired of her. She's an old habit. There are moments when he needs her, but on the whole he wouldn't miss her if she were removed. And what's more, to-day she knows it. So you needn't be jealous," the Countess added humorously. Isabel rose from her sofa again. She felt bruised and scant of breath. Her head was humming with new knowledge. "I'm much obliged to you," she repeated. And then she added abruptly, in quite a different tone, "How do you know all this?" This inquiry appeared to ruffle the Countess more than Isabel's expression of gratitude pleased her. She gave her companion a bold stare, with which, "Let us assume I've invented it," she cried. She too, however, suddenly changed her tone, and laying her hand on Isabel's arm, said, with the penetration of her sharp, bright smile, "Now will you give up your journey?" Isabel started a little; she turned away. But she felt weak, and in a moment had to lay her arm upon the mantel-shelf for support. She stood a minute so, and then upon her arm she dropped her dizzy head, with closed eyes and pale lips. "I've done wrong to speak. I've made you ill!" the Countess cried. "Ah, I must see Ralph!" Isabel wailed, not in resentment, not in the quick passion her companion had looked for, but in a tone of far-reaching, infinite sadness. CHAPter 52